This is Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, I got a bit that I want to continue with this week from last week, so let's just get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So we sure would appreciate it if you could hop on over to the libertyworksradionetwork.com website if you're not already there now, listening through the online radio link, and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member. Even if it's as little as $15, $20 a month, every membership helps, and we do need the support of the audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So if you enjoy the shows, the information, the lectures, the revelations, the guests, and the hosts on the other shows on the network, that's libertyworksradionetwork.com. Get signed up, spread the word, tell neighbors, friends, relatives, family, business associates, and everyone. Help spread the word of freedom and restore constitutional operation to the government in our republic. Okay, so I guess everybody knows the news today, this week, is the Democrats go ahead and shut the government down. They would not sign a clean CR, continuing resolution, which they've done dozens of times, and it's exact same CR proposal that they've signed in the past. This time they didn't want to do it in order to keep the government open. So they refuse to negotiate. They refuse to come to the table. They're insisting on some $1.4 trillion in Obamacare subsidies be put back on the table. That's not how a CR works. It's never worked that way in the past. The Republicans, when they were in the minority, didn't demand any concessions in order to agree to a CR to keep the government open while the two parties in Congress work together to create a proper budget, which of course government hasn't done since like the 1970s. They've actually done a budget something like 4 times in 55 years. So the whole thing is fraud. But nevertheless, in the past, the Democrats have been loath to let the government get shut down and have always tried to blame the Republicans. But this time, there's pretty much no doubt about who's responsible. Schumer doesn't want to deal with Trump because he's afraid of AOC going after his Senate seat in New York. So he has to cater to the far extreme left that votes for AOC. I'm not sure Schumer's fears are actually real because AOC is popular in New York City, which is a deep blue area, but the rest of New York State is red. If you look at New York, it looks like just like all the other states. If you look at them county by county, red and blue, most of the entire state is red. It's just that the red states are the rural demographic, where only a few people live. The two parts that are blue, Buffalo and New York City, are deep blue, and that's where the majority of the population in New York lives. I guess Albany is probably blue too, but I don't even know that for a fact. But most of the state is red, so I'm not sure AOC could win the Senate seat in New York from Schumer, but that's what he's afraid of. So he won't let the Senate sign a CR because they want to pretend like the $1.4 trillion that they want for Obamacare subsidies, which, if you remember, Obamacare was passed without a single Republican vote. And it was turned into a tax by the judicial legislation of Chief Justice Roberts, who rewrote the bill for the Democrats and Obama because the penalty was unconstitutional. And that's what's in the bill, a penalty for not buying the insurance. It wasn't written as a tax. Pelosi and Schumer didn't want to be accused of writing tax law, so the only places in the whole 2,500 pages of the Obamacare bill where tax appears is in the Cadillac tax for platinum plans and in the medical devices tax. Nowhere else in the section is there any tax. It's a penalty. And the court said, first thing right out of the gate, the penalty's unconstitutional. You can't penalize someone for not acting, but you can tax them. But instead of sending the bill back to Congress to be rewritten as a tax bill and re-argued back to the Supreme Court as such, no, Chief Justice Roberts knew that was never going to happen because the Republicans had taken control of the Congress. So it was never going to be reenacted as a tax. So Chief Justice Roberts did it for them. Oh, isn't that sweet? Conservative wolf in sheep's clothing, liberal wolf in sheep's clothing, pretending to be conservative. Judicial legislation from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, mind-boggling. But anyway, the Obamacare passed without a single Republican vote. The subsidies for passed during the COVID era were, well, anyway, the Republicans never voted for Obamacare. They didn't want it, and they're certainly not putting $1.4 trillion on the line in order to get to a CR to keep the government open for 6 weeks while they figure out the budget. That kind of subsidy is the kind of thing that's figured out in the budget negotiations, not to put in place a continuing resolution. So the Democrats have closed the government, and it's my opinion that Donald Trump should use this opinion to fix everything. We can fix the budget, we can fix the deficit, we can fix the disbalance in economic and political power that exists today. Because all of these government agencies and departments that have been created, things like the Agricultural Department in 1862 when they used the emergency of the Civil War to invade agriculture, it's not a constitutional activity, it's a state activity. Commerce, 1903, Labor, 1913, HUD, 1965, the Civil Rights Era, Transportation, 67, EPA, 1970, OSHA, 1970. The Energy Department wasn't created until 1977 and Carter's energy crisis. The Education Department is 1979. None of these departments or agencies are authorized under the United States Constitution. So we can see that the federal government used emergencies like the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, the energy crisis, etc., to create an agency or department outside of authority under the Constitution to allegedly address the crisis or emergency developing in the area for whatever reason, war, energy, whatever reason. Now, all of these agencies then get federal funding. And that, of course, becomes the problem, because that's the reason why the states were not able and have not been able to be more aggressive in managing their own affairs. They simply don't have access to the budget dollars necessary to do this, because they don't have access to the Federal Reserve Bank, and the federal government does. So each time the government creates an agency that there's no constitutional authority for, like agriculture, energy, and education, they then start spending money on that and use the money to compel the states to adopt federal standards or federal programs in order to receive their share of the budgeted dollars for education or whatever. Also, all of the money then ends up getting spent out of Washington, D.C. So it enriches the politicians, the government contractors, the government bureaucracy, which gets enlarged and pay raises every year. Everything about the federal government gets increased in power, both politically and economically, while everything about the states is diminished and removed from relativity, removed from being relevant. So the government has unconstitutionally taken over all of these areas of our society. And now that the federal government is closed, we should use this opportunity to fix all of these things that are wrong. We can take all of these government agencies that don't exist under the Constitution and eliminate them. Make them a small office of 10 to 20 persons inside the Department of Interior to coordinate with what's going to be in the future state programs. Because what we're going to do to fix the problem and take advantage of this is while the government's closed, they should take all of these unconstitutional agencies, eliminate them, and combine the budget dollars for all of them, which should then be distributed to the states to administer for education, agriculture, energy, environment, occupational safety, housing, labor, commerce, transportation. None of these federal agencies are necessary. These are all state functions. None of these agencies are constitutionally authorized. We can use the elimination of the agencies to take the collective budget dollars and slash them for these unconstitutional departments across the board by 10%. We slash the rest of the government by 5% every year until the budget is balanced. Slash the state funds 10%. They won't mind because last year they didn't get a dime. And they'll know right out of the gate that they're only going to get big dollars the first few years, and after that they'll have to live on the 10% reduction that comes every year. So put in place your infrastructure up front to manage the program going forward afterwards. All of these state budget dollars will give power back to the states. It will start money being spent out of the state capitals instead of just Washington, D.C. So we'll be stimulating economy, jobs, employment, and industry in all 50 states, out of all 50 state capitals. You want to share the wealth? This is how you do it. You make the federal government give these dollars being unconstitutionally spent wastefully and ineffectively by the federal government. It's using the programs to seize control of America, not to put in place programs that help the American people. All of this money should be spent by the states on programs that help the people in their state. It should not be spent by the federal government to corrupt, influence, take over, and then control the state operations in these program areas. So you want to close the unconstitutional agencies, slash their budget across the board 10%, deliver the money to the states to spend in their own state proportionately to the census, and continue slashing the budget every year, 5% across the board federally, 10% across the board for the state programs, until the budget is balanced. You have to do it. You can't keep running it out. As goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life of its people. If you print your currency into oblivion, there will be no coming back. So you need to cut the unconstitutional operations, stop the deficit spending, stop the reckless borrowing, make the federal government live within its budget. And the budget needs to come not from the direct taxation of the labors of the American people, but through the taxation without deduction, loss, or expense of all the companies operating in the country. They were the intended object of the income tax, but taxing profit has let them escape the tax by artificial accounting, which inflates the expenses and deducts bonuses and other expenses of the company at the end of the year, so that there's no tax, no profit left to pay tax on. It all got spent in December. Oh, what a shame. So you need to tax corporate revenues, not at 40%, but at 5%. Every company, every month. Make every company and business in the country become a meaningful contributor to the Treasury on a monthly basis. 5%, turn it in. At the end of the year, file a simple return doing the accounting, showing the total earnings, the money submitted, the 5% due, and the balance. So we terminate the income tax. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back in 5 with more. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into it. When we came up on that commercial break, I was saying that, in addition, during the government shutdown, to the opportunity here to slash the government bureaucracy, cut the government budget, start sharing dollars with the state governments, reducing the political, economic, and central control of the federal government by sharing the ability to have access to the capital, which the federal government has a monopoly on by its relationship with the Federal Reserve Bank, which the states are excluded from. And it is that monopoly that allows the federal government and has allowed it to take over virtually every aspect of our society. To stop this, to stop the government from taking over the federal government, to re-empower the state governments to manage their own affairs in the areas of education, agriculture, energy, housing, transportation, commerce, labor, environmental protection, occupational safety. We should close the government agencies, take all the government budget dollars, slash them 10%, and divide them proportionately under the census to the state governments to manage their own affairs in all of those areas, and to start booming economies in all 50 states, because the money's being spent out of the state capital in the state instead of being spent by the federal government and sent all over the planet instead of kept in the 50 states. So you reduce the bureaucracy, you reduce the power, you reduce their economic power, you share the economic wealth with the states, you let the state governments come back and take control of their own activities in their own states and all of the areas that they were supposed to be managing from the beginning, but couldn't in an inflationary paper money environment because only the federal government has that monopoly on access to the currency. Now, to re-empower the people, you have to eliminate the income tax, which has allowed the entire burden of the federal tax system to be shifted away from the intended licensed corporate subjects, licensed subjects and commodities, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms transactions, subject to indirect taxation. We need to restore the fundamental right of the people to work without direct federal taxation, which the Supreme Court has given us in the Moore decision. Income taxes are indirect taxes, and direct taxes must be apportioned. That means that what the federal government was doing for 55 years is a constitutional fraud. An absolute constitutional fraud. The income tax needs to end, and there won't be any point in trying to tax the profits of the companies because, surprise, through their accounting, they don't have any. You need to tax the revenues of the companies, which is not a direct tax because you're taxing their privilege of incorporation and doing business in the country. Citizens don't operate by privilege, they have a right. So you can't tax their revenues, which would be a direct tax. But you can do that to the corporations because although it feels direct, it's not. It's indirect by excise, which taxes the privileged corporate person. So you tax revenues, not at 40%, but at 5%. Every single penny made by every single company operating in America, foreign, domestic, should send in 5% of the revenues realized every single month. And this way, you fund the government and its legitimate activities, because whatever budget results is the budget the government needs to learn to live within. So you get rid of the income tax, you tax corporate revenues, you eliminate the Internal Revenue Service and immediately reconstitute it as the Corporate Revenue Service. No confusion there about who's taxed. It's not internal, it's corporate, it's privileged, it's licensed, it's foreign. It's not a domestic tax on your right to work. That's slavery. That's unconstitutional direct taxation. And the Supreme Court has just told you so. So you fix the revenue, you fix the budget. Now you have to fix your entitlement programs because they're not entitlements. Your Social Security and Medicare programs are being used to buy the votes of the insecure elderly. It's not a pension, it's not a retirement, it's a welfare program. And the payment should be based not on how much you paid in as tax, because that's not the way tax works, but rather should be based on your need at the time the payment is made to an eligible beneficiary. Right now, it's the upper middle wealthy who are getting Social Security checks upwards of $3,000 to $4,000. Meanwhile, the poor that need the money, they're getting $500, $600, $700. You can't live on that. They've reversed the program. It's no longer welfare for the poor, it's a subsidy for the wealthy to keep them voting for the liberals who put the welfare program in place. Both Social Security and Medicare need to be means tested. That means that if you have a certain net worth above a certain level, you're not eligible for the benefit. Why on earth are you giving Social Security to people with a net worth of over $1 million? If your assets minus liabilities is over $1 million, you shouldn't be getting Social Security. You should be living off of your assets. And when they fall to a certain level, then you'll begin to get a certain percentage. And as they drop down lower, you'll get more until ultimately, if you have a net value of what, less than, I don't know, 60,000, 70,000, 100,000, you'll get 100% of your Social Security benefit, but not until. Maybe at 500,000, you only get 20%, and below that, it drops 20% for every 100. You have to means test the program. You can't keep giving the money to the people that don't need it, because then there's not enough to fund the people that do on the monthly check amount they qualify, which should not be based on how much you paid in, but on the level of need when the eligible benefit payment is made. Same thing with Medicare. Exact same thing with Medicare. You have to means test the payments. The wealthy shouldn't get free medical care just because they're old. That's buying their vote. And it's bankrupting the system because the government, of course, doesn't provide a network of hospitals, doctors, technicians, and nurses to actually provide the care. It pays insurance companies, which steal a large portion of the money because insurance companies do not exist to provide health care. They exist to make profits for their shareholders. So they take a large piece of every payment that's made, and they make sure the doctor is never confronted by the patients with their Hippocratic oath, because the insurance company, playing gatekeeper, makes sure that no patient ever sees the doctor unless his form of payment is already arranged and secured. Turns medicine into a business rather than allowing it to exist as a calling, and compels the doctors to become ruthless and money-oriented rather than health-oriented and care-providing oriented. So, we have the opportunity to do this. And Trump should take advantage of this right now. The government shut it down. You can close the Department of Energy. You can close the Department of Agriculture. You can close the Department of Education. Combine those funds and move them right to the states immediately. No more federal control of those three areas. Then you should look at housing, environment, occupational safety, commerce, labor, and finally, health and human services, which should be moved to the states to set up networks of actual hospitals, doctors, nurses, and EMTs, because that's how you provide health care to the people of a nation. You give them doctors and hospitals. You don't send them to an insurance company. I mean, how effing stupid are ya? Insurance companies don't provide health care or medicine. or emergency care. Only doctors, hospitals, and nurses do that. That's what you should be funding. And we have the opportunity to do that. All you have to do is take the network of hospitals and clinics that you have at the VA, fire all of the bureaucrats you have running the VA, and turn it into the U.S. health corps, and staff it with doctors, nurses, and EMTs at the hospitals and clinics, and open them to the entire United States public. So that you have a public network of hospitals, doctors, and nurses that can be accessed by the general public, as well as the private network of hospitals that already exists for those who have insurance and want to keep it and continue to use it. But the way you deliver healthcare is to fund a network of doctors, hospitals, and you have it in place. You're already funding it. You just need to convert it into a quasi-military U.S. health corps where there will be military accountability, rather than allowing it to continue to be a civilian bureaucracy where there is no accountability and the bureaucrats do nothing but push paper and don't deliver health care to the veterans. Don't believe me? Ask them. Go ahead, ask them. So, that's what you need to do. Is fund a network of publicly run hospitals with doctors, nurses, and how do you get doctors? Yeah, give scholarships, just like they do at the Air Force Academy, Annapolis for the Navy, and West Point for the Army. You offer scholarships to medical school for doctors, nurses, and EMTs in exchange for years of service in the U.S. Health Corps. 7 years for a doctor, 5 years for a nurse, 3 years for an EMT. We'll give you scholarships to med school and the other schools you need to take the position, work for the U.S. Health Corps, and then you can go into the private sector. That's how you create doctors, nurses, and technicians for the private sector after their service in the public sector. That's how you create a network of service for the public. You don't send them to the insurance companies to be raped and then have the claims denied because the insurance companies don't exist to provide health care. So they deny the claims. 90% of them initially. And only if you fight do you actually get the money or a reasonable amount. So that's where we're at. We have the opportunity to do it with the government shutdown. We can fix everything about the government. The centralized control, the ever-expanding, never-ending expanding federal bureaucracy invading every area of our society without constitutional authority to exist within the federal government as such agency or department. You really want to test them? Why don't we make them pass a constitutional amendment to allow them to fund the Air Force? The Air Force has been an absolute necessity in the military since the end of World War I. But they never passed a constitutional amendment to fund an Air Force. There's constitutional authority in the original Constitution for both an Army and a Navy. So we can clearly see you need a constitutional authority to run a military service. But they just created the Air Force out of thin air. They didn't even bother to create an amendment because everybody knew it was necessary. But you should make them go through the formality of adopting the amendment because that will prevent them from doing that, adopting an amendment for things like energy, agriculture, education, commerce, housing, labor, because there's no authority in the Constitution for it, and you can't get 75% of the people or the states to agree that we need that at the federal level. But anybody who objects or argues opposite to that about an Air Force, they're insane. Okay, we'll be back in 5. I hear the second commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back in 5 with more. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into it. In today's show, I've been arguing that the Supreme Court's decision in Moore et al. Opens the door to terminating the income tax and the Internal Revenue Service. I don't believe either can survive the coming revolutions that have already been announced by the Supreme Court. That income tax is not a direct tax, which all direct taxes have to be apportioned to the states for payment. And that's what the government's been doing. They've been telling you, you have to pay because it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. The Supreme Court is saying, oh, direct taxes have to be apportioned to the several states. That means it's unconstitutional to ask you, the American citizen and individual, to pay a direct income tax. Even though it's your earnings, they can't ask you to pay it. If they tax your earnings, they have to send the bill to the states if it's a direct tax. And of course, that's a lie. It's a lie the courts invented with judicial legislation 50 years ago in 1980 and forward in each of the circuits. It was actually a lie created by the Supreme Court in 1955 under Glenshaw Glass, which held that Section 61 was Congress's acting on a power to tax all accessions to wealth. Where the hell did that power come from? All accessions to wealth? What? No, they have power to tax foreign activity by impost, exported goods by duty, and corporations, commodities, and licenses and other privileges by excise. There's no taxation of the all accessions to wealth. That's absurd. That's slavery. You're owned. That implies, without actually saying so, or without actually saying that you're relying on said, direct tax under the 16th Amendment without limitation, which is a fraud. The 16th Amendment cannot confer a new power to tax directly and without limitation, because that would be a new power, and there's no enabling enforcement clause in the amendment to authorize Congress at the constitutional level to write new law to implement the new power. Without an authority to write law, the courts can't take jurisdiction. And that's been the problem. They've been fraudulently jamming a direct income tax down your throat, enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Not any legitimate indirect federal taxation by impost, duty, or excise, which powers do not touch the labor of the American people with legal effect, and didn't touch the labors of the American people until after World War II, when the victory tax, which was also an unconstitutional direct tax on the labors of the American people, that they got away with, using World War II as the emergency measure. And then, when nobody complained, because if you complained, what are you, a Nazi or a Jap? And if you complain, they put you in the internment camp, claiming you looked like a Japanese. No, I'm Irish. Yeah, you look like a Japanese to us. In you go. So nobody complained. They got away with the victory tax, a 2-year temporary war revenue funding measure that can only, under the Constitution, last for 2 years, as every and each successive Congress must reenact the funding of the war. And historically, if the government stopped funding it, the soldiers walked away. Well, historically, for most of the world. In America, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, people didn't walk away. They believed in the fight and they stayed. But historically, the Founding Fathers knew that when the government doesn't pay, the soldiers go home. So they made it a provision of the Constitution that in order to be at war, each and every Congress conducting it had to vote for it. to fund it. And thus, if the American people didn't want to be in a war that their political class dragged them into, all they had to do to end the war was vote in a cast of congressmen in the next election. Every 2 years, Congress gets reelected. All you got to do is vote in a cast of congressmen who say they won't fund the war. And that will be the end of the war. So, that's why the Founding Fathers gave the power to the American people to decide, reevaluate every 2 years whether or not they still wanted to continue being in the war and funding it, funding an army to fight it, a navy to fight it, and see the consequences, however they may play out around the world or in America. So, the victory tax was a 2-year war revenue measure that expired in 1944, and they couldn't put another 2-year war revenue measure in because essentially the war was over. In 1945, it was clear Nazi Germany was going to fall soon. So they didn't do another 2-year revenue measure, but seeing how successful their direct tax on labor had been, and nobody complained, what they did was they reenacted a new law, the current legislation we're under, the Subtitle C employment tax laws, where there's no tax imposed on your labor. The victory tax imposed a tax, but the new Subtitle C law doesn't impose a tax. It just authorizes you as the employee to authorize your employer to deduct money from your paycheck for tax. Because you believe you have to let them do that. It's not true. There's no tax due when you get paid. Tax is not due until next year on April 15th. And no one can force you to pay a tax before it's legally due without violating the involuntary servitude of the 13th Amendment, because it's involuntary servitude to make someone service a future tax debt or legal obligation that does not yet exist as a legal obligation that is due. Just like you can't enforce final payment of a contract until the end of the contract and the work has been performed. You can't demand it up front. You can ask for it up front, and if they give it to you, you can keep it. But if they say, no, you can't get it till it's legally due, you can't force them to pay it early, which is what the IRS has been doing to the American people through the employment tax since the end of World War II. Deceiving them into believing they owe a tax that isn't imposed and is constitutionally impossible to impose. Because you can't be compelled to pay a direct tax, and indirect taxes don't tax your labor, right to work, right to property, or any other activity in the 50 states that isn't subject to some federal impost on foreign activity, duty on exported goods, or excise on commodities, licenses, and corporations. Your labor isn't subject to indirect taxation. That's the fraud. And we have an opportunity right now to end it. The Supreme Court has said income taxes are indirect. That means if there's no impost, duty, or excise, there is no tax to measure by income. Income is not the object of federal taxation. It's not the subject of the federal taxation. It's the yardstick. It's the mechanism by which the amount of tax owed is measured. It's a measurement, but if there's no impost, duty, or excise, there's nothing to measure. You don't just then go and tax the yardstick. Oh, you made $100,000, you owe it to us. Why? I worked in the state of Virginia, or California, or New York, or Massachusetts, or Florida. You have no legislative or territorial authority to write law for labor in the state. That's a state function. You can't tax labor. That's a direct tax. You can't tax revenue unless it's apportioned to the states. Taxes on persons or their labor revenue derived from living and working are direct taxes, just like taxes on property. The key is, can the tax be avoided? Where there is a mechanism within the law to avoid the tax, it's indirect. Where there is no mechanism that can be utilized to avoid the payment of the tax, it is direct. And those taxes must be apportioned to the several states in proportion to the census. Just like I'm proposing allocating to the states in proportion to the census a share of the federal budget dollars for all of the unconstitutional departments and agencies that we have the opportunity to close right now with the government shut down. You terminate the income tax, replace it with a corporate earnings tax of 5%, slash the federal budget across the board 5%, 10% across the board for the funds for the departments and agencies you're closing to distribute to the state so they can start economic booms by spending those funds for education, energy, agriculture, housing, commerce, transportation, environment, occupational safety in their own state. In their own state, not in Washington, D.C., where everybody's getting rich off of the spending and none of it's being spent in the 50 states. Give that money, slash the government. Here's your chance to slash the federal government, to eliminate the control, the financial control, and the bureaucratic power, the never-ending bureaucracy invading the private sector and destroying the quality of life by raising, through regulations, the cost of doing business in every area of society. This is a federal bureaucracy taking over through the monopolistic power of currency and credit that it enjoys. The way to defeat the federal growing monster is to take away the spending power, take away the monopoly on currency, make them share the spending power with the states. And this is your opportunity to do it. And there isn't any other way of going forward much further. They're running it out. We're at 37, about to go to 40 trillion, and it will soon thereafter be 50, 60, 70. When does it break? Well, as the Bible says, no man shall know the day of his coming. This is sort of the same thing. There's no way to predict when, only that it will. Only that at some point it will. So we need to take these points in time where we're given the opportunity to act because the federal government has sat down and gone away, and while they're out, we should move in and take back our country. Take it back from the federal bureaucracy. Take it back from the Internal Revenue Service. Take it back from the Federal Reserve Bank, who for the last 4 years has denied Main Street access to capital, giving it all to the institutions, which is why all three markets are at all-time high, despite the fact that on Main Street things are faltering. The job reports aren't as good as we've been told, lied to by the Biden administration. 2 million jobs eliminated. 2 million jobs, they said, were being created, which is why the Federal Reserve Bank didn't lower interest rates. There's too many jobs. It's too strong an economy. It was all a lie. It's all a lie. You want to learn the truth? Taxfreedom.com and IRSZoom.com. Get on over, start reading. Send your friends, neighbors, relatives, and business acquaintances to get informed, or we're going down. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back next week with more on more. Thank you.